and nothing is but what is not. William Shakespeare, Macbeth. In this chapter, I will present several irrefutable proofs that the NASA Apollo moon landings were faked. Although NASA did a commendable job in the 1960s to produce such a convincing fake, it was just not good enough to avoid detection under serious analysis. Remember that back in the 1960s there was no CGI or much in the way of special effects technology. It all had to be achieved using models and captured directly into the camera. Given this, we can only admire the people who worked on this project of deceit for their undoubted skill. Looking at the moon. We all know how the moon looks when viewed from Earth, but what would it look like if we were standing on its surface? This was the first problem that NASA needed to solve if they were really going to fake the moon landings. Naturally, they had a certain amount of leeway given that nobody else knew either. They did have some grainy black and white photographs from the Surveyor probe which landed on the moon in 1966 to 1968 to guide them. In 1966, NASA launched the Lunar Orbiter program, a series of unmanned satellites in orbit around the moon, specifically to photograph the lunar surface and identify suitable landing sites for the Apollo missions. In all, a total of 5 lunar orbiters were launched between 1966 and 1967. The cameras on these satellites used a dual lens system and photographed almost all of the near side of the lunar surface with a claimed resolution of 60 meters. NASA used these detailed photographs to create large-scale models of the total moon, parts of the moon, and sophisticated simulators in which the astronauts could realistically practice moon landings. I can well imagine that if you are obsessed with a serious, compelling intention to go land on the moon and to walk about, then it may be wise to have a little practice before setting off. NASA even created an actual full-size copy of the Apollo landing site, the Sea of Tranquility, in North Arizona by blasting craters out of volcanic rock. In total, they created 47 craters of between 5 and 40 feet in diameter designed to duplicate a full-scale replica of the Apollo 11 landing site. You can still see it on Google Earth if you search for Cinder Lake, Arizona. Ostensibly, this was to test out the lunar rover, but you may wonder, why did they need an exact replica of the Apollo 11 landing site when the lunar rover was only scheduled for missions 15, 16, and 17? The craters today have been very much reduced both in scale and in perceptibility due to the site being used by public thrill seekers as a ready-made and excitingly unusual off-road driving experience. You may think that you are looking at the surface of the moon, but this is entirely man-made here on Earth. In fact, several crater fields were made in Arizona as described in this paper from David A. Kring. If NASA were to create a complete fake stage set on which to film the Apollo footage, then they needed to have a realistic topographical detail of the landing sites in order to be convincing. These detailed stereoscopic photographs from the orbiter satellite provided the detailed image data with which to create these training sets here on Earth. They then used this data to construct several large models of the moon and much more detailed models of particular areas of the moon, notably the planned Apollo landing sites, in order to familiarize and train the astronauts. The success of the hoax depended upon the accuracy of these models. These following images were obtained from the NASA archives and show some of the extremely large-scale models that NASA constructed based on the lunar orbiter photographs. Front screen projection. We are now going to examine a short movie. It is the opening scene, The Dawn of Man, from Stanley Kubrick's acclaimed movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. Did you notice anything? No? I don't mean to put you on the spot. The apes were really humans dressed in furry suits and just pretending to be apes. It is more about the scenery, not the actors, so watch again. You will see that the picture appears to be in 2 separate pieces, the foreground and the distant scenery beyond it. You will notice that there is a horizontal line which separates the two, as indicated here in the outtake by the black superimposed line. Here we have another example taken from the same movie, again with a dividing line between the real foreground and the projected background image shown in white. The dividing line has been added to show the join more clearly. Below this line is a real stage set, while above the line we have a projected image. This line is often referred to as the Kubrick horizontal and is the indisputable fingerprint signature of the front screen projection technique. The technique of front screen projection was invented by Philip B. Palmquist, who, while working at the 3M Corporation, received a patent on the technology, also won an Academy Award for the invention. It was first experimented with shortly after the invention of Scotch light in 1949 and had appeared in feature films by 1963 when the Japanese horror film Mantago used it for its yacht scenes. This technique was used by Stanley Kubrick in the making of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and as we shall soon discover, it was later used extensively by NASA to fake the Apollo moon landing footage. This technique is shown and explained in the making of documentary of the 1970 sci-fi film Silent Running, which was directed by Douglas Trumbull. At time 3151 to 3633, Trumbull describes how the front screen projection system works. Note that Douglas Trumbull was a special effects supervisor for Stanley Kubrick on the 2001: A Space Odyssey movie. We will encounter Douglas Trumbull again later in our story. Another explanation of front screen projection is shown in this video from Shanks FX PBS Digital Studios. An illustration of the front screen projection setup is shown in this diagram. A two-way mirror is used at an angle of 45 degrees to the screen. A camera is then positioned to record the live action, and a projector beams the pre-recorded image onto the mirror. The mirror is used to bring the two images together to create the illusion that it is one scene. Hopefully, we all now understand the importance of the Kubrick horizontal and its relationship to front screen projection techniques. If the Kubrick horizontal can be discerned in a photograph or video, then it is almost always proof that the front screen projection technique has been used and the resulting scene must have been faked. We can examine the Apollo photographs and videos to look for evidence of the front screen projection technique being employed. Apollo and the Kubrick horizontal. We will now study some of the Apollo photographs and examine them for the telltale fingerprint signature of the front screen projection process. First, we will examine NASA's photograph taken from Apollo 17. This is a clear Kubrick horizontal in this photograph as indicated by the white line in the following photograph. Below this line, the foreground is the real stage set, while above the line we are seeing a projected image, most probably a painted image, which is extremely matte. There is no question that this is the telltale fingerprint of front screen projection. We can detect this Kubrick horizontal in most of the NASA Apollo images and videos. I did say that if the Kubrick horizontal can be discerned in a photograph or video, then it is almost always proof of the front screen projection technique. I say almost always because there are some exceptions and some quite genuine photographs or videos that can sometimes show such a line between the foreground and the background. For example, if you stand on one side of the Grand Canyon and take a photograph of the view, but get your side of the canyon at the bottom of the picture, then it will look like there is a Kubrick horizontal in your genuine photograph. This photograph is a real photograph of the Grand Canyon, which has the white line added showing the separation between the front scenery and the distant background. This photograph could be mistakenly assumed to have a Kubrick horizontal, but it is a genuine photograph. However, such photographic composition is very exceptional and usually only occurs if you are situated on some plateau. Here we have another example from the Apollo 15 mission, which landed in the Hadley Apennine region or high mountains. Again, we see the clear fingerprint of the front screen projection. This quite unmistakable Kubrick horizontal is clear, indisputable evidence of the NASA fakery. On occasions, they used a false Kubrick horizontal in the projected image, presumably to try and disguise the real Kubrick horizontal. For example, look at this moonscape taken by the camera on the lunar rover on Apollo 17. In this screenshot, you can see a real foreground and the actual Kubrick horizontal, then what appears to be a second Kubrick horizontal, which is in fact just a part of the projected background. I have placed a short black line at the edges to indicate the lines. It is used on several missions, but in my opinion, rather than disguise the real Kubrick horizontal, it just focuses your eye on it. NASA did not use front screen projection in all cases. For example, it does not appear to have been used on Apollo 11, as we can see from this panorama shown on www.panorama.dk. Of particular interest is the panorama shown on Apollo 17, in which the Kubrick horizontal is so patently obvious across the complete panorama. One thing to note is that the painted projected backgrounds did slightly improve in the later Apollo missions as more detailed shading was added to the painting backdrops, but even so, the backgrounds are plain and featureless. I mentioned above that the Apollo 11 panoramic photographs did not appear to have involved the front screen projection technique. It could well be that it was the first Apollo mission which was chosen to land in a relatively flat area of the Moon, the Sea of Tranquility. Then perhaps they concluded that there were no distant mountains to show. However, an analysis of the Apollo 11 photography by Andreas Marquis, posted on the ALICE.com website, conclusively proves that the photographs cannot have been carried out on the Moon, but must have been taken on some studio set. The author concludes, "In a real environment, this limited visibility would only be possible from an 8,600 meter high platform with no visible mountains in the neighborhood of 170 kilometers. All of this fits with neither to the Moon in general nor to the Sea of Tranquility in particular. But it does correspond perfectly with these images having been created in a studio environment where they can only see a limited surface area, the equivalent of an illuminated foreground in the recreations. Therefore, this study concludes that the Apollo 11 still photography images and the live TV coverage must have been taken in a studio on Earth. Again, we have another undeniable proof that the Apollo 11 photography and supposedly live TV transmissions were not made from the Moon. There is also the proof of the NASA fakery in the live TV transmission made on July 20th, 1969. As it was the first moon landing, and presumably NASA was not sure that the fake would be undetectable and purposefully used very low quality black and white video. To disguise any errors further, they did not supply the TV companies with a direct feed, but made them film from a large projection screen. Watch this video from time 35 to time 3650. Notice that as the camera pans around the stage set, a pool of lights follow the camera as though a light is attached on the top of the camera. If you look closely, you will see that this light also illuminates the black background, which is supposedly the blackness of space, but is in fact the projection screen. The light source not only illuminates the surface of the Moon, but also the background screen, as you can see a clear circular pool of light. In a relatively flat area, the surface of the Moon should be evenly lit by the Sun, but is clearly not. There is no question that this video has been faked in a studio. Stage set. There is no doubt that we are dealing with a sizable stage set. I estimate that the stage set was very large, circular in nature, with a radius of about 250 to 300 meters, as can be roughly judged from the location of the Kubrick horizontal in many of NASA's videos. The size of the stage has also been estimated using a method of stereoscopic parallax by Oleg Olenek, posted on the ALICE website. The method is based on the fact that with stereoscopic images, the background should not show any parallax movement, but he demonstrates that it does, so the conclusion must be that these cannot be real photographs taken on the Moon. He estimates the distance on the Apollo 15 mission to the mountain range as being less than 300 meters and not the supposed 5 kilometers if the photograph was real. This first analysis by Olenek is very revealing in several ways. First, using stereoscopic parallax on several Apollo panoramic photographs, he firmly concludes that the photographs must have been taken on some stage set and could not have been taken on the Moon. Secondly, he examines the horizontal stereoscopic effect and again concludes that the photographs must have been taken on a stage set. Finally, he examines the distortion grid of the background lunar landscape using a method of digital distortion to the sections of the image, which he says, this method can determine the nature of simulation of any background landscape. For example, build a distortion grid and inspect it. Obviously, if the distortion grid has a curved surface, then it corresponds to a projection at the rear of the circular panorama scene, creating a simulation of a remote background scape on the projection screen. Instead of taking pictures in a remote landscape, the astronauts take pictures of a foreground with the background projected onto the screen. This method is rather complex, but suffice it is to say that from this method, he can roughly estimate the radius of the circular panorama screen by a distortion grid. From this, he confirms the fact that the lunar landscape was projected onto a forward-tilted, slightly convex panorama background screen. He concludes that the study of stereoscopic effect in the photographs that he analyzes shows that these images do not contain distant objects further than a few hundred meters away. In particular, he states, The Apollo 15 photographic record contradicts the stereoscopic parallax verification method. The apparent change in the relative positions of objects by the moving of the camera when the camera angles are separated by several tens of centimeters show that 1. The distance to distant objects, such as mountains, is not tens of kilometers, but is no more than a few hundred meters. 2. The landscape is not continuous, but with clear lines of separation. And 3. There is movement between nearby sections of the panorama relative to the other sections. Thus, based on these three examples, this study concludes that the Apollo 15 photographic record does not depict real lunar landscapes with distant backgrounds located more than a kilometer away from the camera. These pictures were, without a doubt, taken in a studio setup 300 meters in size. A complex panorama mimicking the landscape shows degrees of movement such as horizontal and vertical changes to give an impression of imagery distance to the objects and perspective. In conclusion, the detailed analysis of the Apollo moon photographs by Oleg Olenek is just one more irrefutable example of proof that the Apollo moon missions were totally faked. There has been much criticism of the moonscapes shown in the NASA photographs and videos. Basically, they do not look real, but more like poorly painted images which are bland and with no detail. We have already seen telltale evidence of the Kubrick horizontal in most of the videos and photographs, but let us look in more detail to confirm our suspicions. First of all, we will examine a couple of the panoramas taken by the Apollo TV camera mounted on the Lunar Rover module for the Apollo 16 posted on YouTube by pro-NASA Bertie Slack. Again, we see the same nonsensical, bland featureless scenery which NASA hopes will convince us all that we are actually seeing the moon. I confess that I have never visited the moon, but to my mind, seeing the photographs of the moon, it should look better than this fabricated imagery produced by the DevTon studio team. Instead, NASA wants us to believe that this panorama, as shown on the TV camera of the Apollo 16, was actually taken on the moon. A total featureless landscape which is devoid of any significant detail. It shows an almost smooth surface, almost empty of any rock and debris and craters. If you think that I am being unfairly too sensitive in showing the above image, take a look at all the full panoramas. We have further evidence, if it were indeed needed, in this excellent video by Ted Aranda posted on the ApolloMoonHoax.net website. Unfortunately, the video is a full 4 hours long, but thankfully I do ask you to take a look and watch all of it, as I have extracted the relevant parts of this video into several separate videos with the author's permission. Having said that, if you have the time, then it is well worth watching the entire video. The video can be found on www.apollomoonhoax.net. The main video deals with the visions of the moon that were shown to us by NASA. Ted Aranda shows us how fragmented the moon's surface should be based on the photography taken by the lunar orbiters. He then goes on to look at several of the individual Apollo landing sites and examines what we are shown by NASA. Apollo 14 landing site. He first comments on the featureless landscapes devoid of any significant craters or boulders that are claimed by NASA as being seen on the moon. He then goes on to look in detail at the Apollo 14 landing site. Apollo 14 landed in the Frau-Moreau Formation, which is a hilly area with hills several hundreds of feet high. He explains that one stated objective of this Apollo mission was to visit a crater known as Cone Crater. He provides evidence that there is no such crater and that the image has been doctored with this non-existent crater. By examining pre-Apollo images of the moon, he finds that there is no evidence of Cone Crater. I personally do not understand why NASA should have done this. He examines the EVA to Cone Crater and notes some strange reasons given by the astronauts why they never found the alleged Cone Crater. He also notes that the panorama taken close to the supposed Cone Crater shows a distinct Kubrick horizontal across the entire panorama. There is no question, given the distinct Kubrick horizontal, that this photography and video on Apollo 14 is fake and definitely not taken on the moon. There cannot be a Kubrick horizontal, as they are not on a plateau but on the side of a mountain. Apollo 15 landing site. Apollo 15 landed at the northern end of the Apennine Mountains close to Hadley Rill. The Apennine region contains some of the tallest mountains on the moon. Ted Aranda shows us photographs of mountains here on Earth of similar size to those in Apollo 15 landing area on the Moon as a comparison of what we should see. He notes that Mount Hadley is 4.5 kilometers tall, so taller than Mount Everest here on Earth, which is 4.2 kilometers high, but what do we see in the Apollo imagery is only a gray featureless rounded bump of a hill. Ted Aranda is perhaps more accurate to call it a featureless blob. Also, note the distinct cubic horizontal in the following photograph. He goes on to examine the even worse photographs of Hadley Rill and St. George Crater, which are verging on the comical. There is absolutely no question that these videos and photographs were not taken on the Moon. What truly amazes me is that sensible people can be so indoctrinated to view these photographs and videos and convince themselves that they are really looking at the surface of the Moon. It is beyond comprehension. There is no weathering due to rain or wind on the Moon to produce rounded shapes of the mountains as portrayed by NASA. The only weathering would possibly be by rock fracture due to cycles of extreme heat and cold, that this would only produce very fragmented and craggy mountains as we clearly observe in the orbiter satellite images. The majority of the NASA moonscapes are devoid of any significant features except a few rounded depressions and the occasional odd rock, not much better than your local supermarket parking lot. The NASA artist who painted these background scenes for the Moon certainly got it wrong, or maybe he just had a bad day at the office. I suspect that the background scenes were painted from the artist's view of the NASA Moon models. Apollo 16 landing site. This Apollo mission supposedly landed close to the Descartes Mountains. Ted Aranda compares the NASA satellite photograph of this area with pre-Apollo satellite photograph images and concludes that the NASA released photograph had been doctored. He notes 14 discrepancies between the two photographs. I am not entirely convinced by his argument, as the pre-Apollo satellite photograph is of an extremely low resolution. On Apollo 16, the astronauts had the lunar rover, so were able to cover great distances in their EVAs. The astronauts supposedly drove right up to the edge of North Ray Crater, which has a diameter of 950 meters and is 270 meters deep. But this is what NASA wants us to believe is the crater, together with a close-up of the crater. The far side of the crater is supposed to be 1 kilometer away, but you can still see the rocks on the far side. There is no way that a human eye could resolve the small or even large rocks at a 1 kilometer distance. It is also supposed to be almost 1 kilometer wide. Clearly, the NASA artist had a problem with scale. Ted Aranda makes a valid comparison with Meteor Crater in Arizona, USA, which has similar dimensions, although 60% as deep as the North Ray Crater. There is no comparison between the pathetic NASA attempt to depict North Ray Crater as a real crater. See in Meteor Crater how it would be impossible to resolve individual rocks on the far side of the crater. He concludes that the evidence presented by NASA on the Apollo 16 mission is pure and simple fakery. It is just one more proof that the Apollo missions were deviously faked by NASA. Apollo 17 landing site. This mission landed in the Taurus Littrow Valley area adjacent to the Sea of Serenity. Again, Ted Aranda expresses his doubts about the authenticity of the NASA photograph of the landing site. It may well be that this true but pre-Apollo photograph he uses for comparison is a very low resolution, so it is hard to discern the detail. The astronauts supposedly visited Camelot Crater, which is about half the size of Meteor Crater that we discussed in the Apollo 16 landing examination above. This is the NASA photograph showing the crater supposedly taken by the astronauts. Ted Aranda notes that the same problems that he saw in Apollo 16, the crater shown is far too small to be half a kilometer across. You can judge the scale from the lunar rover parked on the left. Also, note once again the cubic horizontal in this panorama and the fact that you can see individual rocks on the far side of the crater. We also have an investigation by Colin Rourke in a paper posted on the ALICE.com website. In this analysis, he looks at 3 photographs from Apollo 15 showing Mons Hadley. The fact that this outline of Mons Hadley is identical in all 3 photographs, even though they were taken from different angles, leads him to conclude that the photographs must have been faked. There simply cannot be any dispute that the NASA videos and photographs were not really made on the Moon. I often wonder why I managed to believe in NASA's story for almost 50 years. I think the simple reason is because I blindly accepted whatever NASA published as being the truth without any further research. The fact that NASA could make such a monumentous deceit was just too unthinkable and perhaps also impossible to imagine. I believe that this must have been the position of most genuine believers. I use the word genuine as I can well imagine that the hard-line pro-NASA devotees are somewhat disingenuous in their support of NASA. It has even been suggested that in many quarters that some of these ardent NASA fans are the purse of NASA, but that is pure speculation. Problems orbiting the moon. If you need further proof that the Apollo missions were a hoax, then view on. I am indebted to Pascal Xavier for one of the painstaking analysis provided in this section. The command module, with the lunar module still attached, enters moon orbit in preparation for the moon landing. The two craft separate, the lunar module descends to the moon while the command module stays in orbit. This is the orbit of the command module, which is well documented and shown in the NASA videos. It is this orbit of the command module, which is well documented and shown in the video by NASA, that further exposes the hoax. First, we will need to familiarize ourselves with a little science. When a spacecraft is in orbit around the moon, the spacecraft is subject to two competing forces. The first is the gravitational attraction between the spacecraft and the moon, which pulls the spacecraft downwards towards the moon's surface. The second is the centrifugal force caused by the spacecraft traveling at speed in orbit around the moon. Let's have a quick look at these forces. The first force, gravity, diminishes according to the square of the distance as given by Newton's law on universal gravitation, first published on 5 July 1687. The formula published is F equals G m1 m2 over r squared, where F is the gravitational force acting between two objects, m1 is the mass of object 1, m2 is the mass of object 2, r is the distance between the centers of their masses, and G is the gravitational constant. So the farther apart the two objects are, the lesser the gravitational pull. The second force is the centrifugal force caused by the object rotating around a center. No doubt you are all familiar with the swinging of a bucket of water over your head, and thankfully the water does not fall out of the bucket as it passes overhead. The water is being held in the bucket by the centrifugal force. Unlike gravity, which diminishes according to the inverse square of the distance, this force is linear relative to the distance, but depending on the speed of rotation. This force pushes the spacecraft away from the moon. It is these two competing forces which affect the orbital dynamics. Note that as the spacecraft's orbit gets closer to the moon, then the gravity increases, and therefore to maintain the balanced forces, the speed of the orbit needs to be increased in order to increase the centrifugal force. The question is, what would the command module look like when orbiting the moon? Like this? In fact, no. That is the way you have seen it in the diagrams, cartoons, or in the movies. In the case of the command module, it would orbit in a vertical configuration, either with the nose down, or like this, with its nose up away from the moon's surface, or like this, with the nose down toward the moon, or it should be either nose down towards the moon, or nose up away from the moon, but which one? So let us now look at the detailed masses of the three components of the command module: the crew capsule, the service module, and the rocket skirt. The corresponding weights of each component are as follows. The crew capsule, 12,250 pounds, the service module, 35,000 pounds, and the rocket skirt, 220 pounds. We can clearly see that the center of mass is such that the spacecraft would orient itself with its nose down towards the moon due to the pull of gravity on the center of mass shown by the center of mass line. This is similar to what we saw with the Earth tidally locked to the moon. So what we know is that the Apollo command module would orbit the moon with its nose down. That is simple science. But look at the NASA photograph of the Apollo 11 CSM supposedly orbiting the moon. It is clearly shown orbiting with the capsule's nose upward away from the moon. However, it could be that NASA changed its mind since 1969 and perhaps considers the command module should orbit with its nose down, as shown from the NASA Scientific Visualization Studio published in 2018. It had to be in this orientation to enable the astronauts to take the now iconic photographs of the Earthrise over the moon. Had they been orbiting nose up as shown in 1969, they would have been staring out into space and would not have seen the Earth rise over the moon at all. All we can summarize is that NASA was somehow confused in 1967 about the dynamics of the situation, but was eager to correct it later. If we need further proof that NASA got the video of the Apollo 11 command module orbiting the moon nose up, as shown in the video, then we could take a look at the photograph taken by Michael Collins as he orbited the moon in the CSM. If Collins was orbiting the moon in the command module with the nose up, then he would have been staring into deep space and not down towards the moon as shown in this famous photograph of the Earth majestically rising above the moon, supposedly taken by Collins from the command module. This is more indisputable evidence of the NASA confusion in the fakery.